Welcome to the 33 episode of the series Decolonizing the Mind. Uh, Last week I spoke about the DTM theory of racism, and this episode deals with other theories of racism. But before we start, we still have to remember the horrors that are taking place in Gaza and the genocide that is being committed by the Zionists. And our hearts are with the people of Palestine and Gaza. So I'll discuss how in non-Western cultures superiority inferiority was embedded and how to look at it from a DTM point of view. And I'll look at the liberal theories of racism and the Marxist theory of racism. And I'll deal with two cultures, India, the caste system, and China with the concept of the barbarians. In India, Oliver Cox, a Marxist, has written a great book 50 years ago on race, caste, and class. And he defined the caste as an endogamous and hereditary subdivision of an ethnic unit occupying a position of superior or inferior rank of social esteem in comparison with other such divisions. So what he means is this: caste has four elements. It's an ethnic group with common cultural or physical traits. Caste occupies a position of superiority or inferiority in the social system in comparison with other castes in that system. A caste is endogamous. Marriage is only allowed within the ethnic group, and it is hereditary, meaning that the social position of the individual is inherited from the social position of their parents. Now, there's one estimate of 4,000 castes and subcastes in India, of which the main caste, divided in subcastes, are the Brahmins, the priests, the Kshatriyas, the soldiers, the Vaishyas, traders, and the Sudras, the servants. Now, if you look at what this system means and the horror it can bring with it, you see that in the description of Indian author Arundhati Roy, who did the biographies of Ambedkar, one of the leaders of Indian National Liberation Movement. And she described the caste system in practice as each region of India has lovingly perfected its own unique version of caste-based cruelty based on an unwritten code that is much worse than the Jim Crow laws. These are the laws of apartheid in the United States. In addition to being forced to live in segregated settlements, untouchables, the lower caste, were not allowed to use the public roads that privileged castes use. They were not allowed to drink from common wells. They were not allowed into Hindu temples. They were not allowed into privileged caste schools. They were not permitted to cover their upper bodies. They were only allowed to wear a certain kind of clothes and certain kinds of jewelry. Some castes, like the Mahas, the caste to which Ambedkar belonged, had to tie brooms to their waists to sweep away their polluted footprints. Others had to hang spittoons around their necks to collect their polluted saliva. Men of the privileged caste had undisputed right over the bodies of untouchable women. Love is polluting, rape is pure. Now, there was another caste system in India that was instituted by the British during British colonialism. And Shashi Tharoor, an Indian MP, describes the British caste system in India. He says the British in India created little islands of Englishness, planting ferns and roses and giving their cottages nostalgia sofas named like Grasmere Lodge in Ooty and Willowdale in Darjeeling. By the early 19th century, the British had established themselves as a ruling caste, but at the top of the heap. They didn't intermarry or interdine with the lower caste, in other words, the Indians. They lived in bungalows in their own areas, known as cantonments, and zipper lines separated from the black towns where the locals live. They kept to their clubs, to which Indians were not admitted. Their loyalty remained wedded to the faraway homeland. Their children were shipped off to the British public school system and didn't mingle with the natives. Their clothes and purchases came from Britain, as did their books and ideas. At the end of their careers in India, for the most part, they returned home. Now, during British colonialism, the British criticized the Indian caste system. They had their own caste system, but they did nothing about uh, doing against inequality. After independence in India, the government instituted a policy of affirmative action. 50% of all government-run higher education admissions and government job vacancies may be reserved for members of the lower caste. There were legal provisions for programs for preferential treatment, and but this all is in the legal and the political sphere, in rules and procedures, but changing the psychology of a nation that has suffered from the caste system for centuries, that is not an easy thing. So the caste system isn't gone totally. It is they have achieved enormous success, but they're still in the psychology of the people, a lot of work to be done. Another great nation, China, united under the Qing dynasty in 2002 before Common Era. They brought the different groups together. But some ethnic Chinese tended to feel culturally superior to the non-Chinese, which they call barbarians, while North Chinese tended to regard even South Chinese as barbarians. 1,000 years later, Chinese scholars exhibited notions of superiority and inferiority, but not because they were rulers, but because they were ruled. The Mongols invaded China between 1205 and 1272 and established a unitary state after a period of disintegration of competing states. The Mongols were the rulers and incorporated Chinese officials into their administration. But some Chinese philosophers resented the foreign occupation and articulated their critique in terms of how an inferior ethnic group ruled a superior ethnic group. So, inferiority, superiority is not now about the ruler being superior, but the ruler being inferior. That's quite different. So, if you compare these kind of inferiority superiority complex with Western racism, you see that these pre-colonial, before they were colonized or ruled, as in the case of China, by Western imperial power, they had a wide variety of concepts that combine superiority and inferiority ethnicity. And if you have a superficial comparison with Western colonialism, you might conclude that racism in the Western world is not different from racism in a non-Western world, because concept of superiority and inferiority had been linked to ethnicity. But racism was developed in the West in a totally different context. The rise of an integrated global civilization in which all previous civilizations were overtaken, wiped out, or subjugated. Elements of superiority and inferiority from the old civilizations might have combined with new notions of superiority and inferiority because of the dominating influence of the West. The organization of racist knowledge production and dissemination has developed to an unprecedented scale, leading to such conformity that it doesn't matter whether you study in Nairobi or London, you are taught the same concepts. Technology has created the media infrastructure in such a way that the manipulation of the mind is done on a scale that mankind has not witnessed before in history. So don't equate Western racism with racism from pre non-Western societies. There's a big difference there. Now, let me go to liberal theories of racism. It's important to see that the liberal theory of racism center basically about the notion of the individual. So, in psychological theories, racism about the perception and behavior of individuals, mostly of the races who is inhibited with prejudice. Studies on racism and the Holocaust focus on how personalities are formed in the psychological constitutions. Theories of white privilege, affiliate racism, intersectionality, and critical race take individual experience as the basis of the analysis. That's very different from the attempt that takes institution as the basis of analysis. And the historical connection of racism and colonialism in all three forms, as I explained in the previous video, theological, biological, and cultural racism, that is absence in the analysis and the epistemology of Western Enlightenment that laid the foundation, the theoretical foundation of racism, is also not part of the theory. So the liberal theories are basically insufficient theories of racism. Now, let's start with the first one, the concept of prejudice. One definition of prejudice is that it is an opinion about an individual, group, or phenomena that is developed without proof or systematic evidence. The prejudgment may be favorable, but is more of an unfavorable and may be institutionalized in the form of a country's laws or customs. Apartheid, for example. So racism is about stereotyping and generalizing about people using usually negatively because of their race, commonly a basis of discrimination against members of a racial group. So negative stereotyping is seen as the cause of racist behavior. The assumption is that all people are born with a mind that serves as a blank slate, a tabula rasa, that is filled with ideas and perceptions through experience and education. Racism is combated by giving the right information so that opinion and thus behavior is based on correct information. And correct information is information that proves that prejudices are wrong. A rational person would then cast away racist opinions and change their behavior. Now, my critique of it is this. Just empirical validation proves it wrong. How do you explain the most racist phenomena in world history, the European enslavement of Africans? The image of Africans before in Europe was positive. Why did it change? Psychologists cannot answer this question. They can't answer why racism didn't cause slavery. Slavery caused racism, as I explained in my previous video. So by empirical validation, this psychological theory is just wrong. And the solution of providing correct information has been given. There are a lot of intellectuals who are racist, who are very well informed. As I explained, Kant, Hegel, all these Enlightenment philosophers were in the core racist. They were very well informed. It's not a question of not being informed. So correct information doesn't work. The second approach is in Germany after World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust, social scientists, one of the leading ones, Adorno, put up a scale, a fascist scale, to explain why the Holocaust occurred. Then you have the Milgram experiment, test personalities, and a study of Goldhagen on why Hitler had such mass support in Germany. Now, Theodor Adorno was concerned with fascism and anti-Semitism because of Nazism and the Holocaust. He argued that the political, economic, and social convictions of an individual, you see an individual, often form a broad and coherent pattern as if bound together by a mentality or spirit, and this pattern is an expression of deep-lying trends in his personality. So he says there's a certain type of individual who's prone to becoming a fascist. And Adorno says the major concern was with the potentially fascistic individual on whose structure is such as to render her particularly susceptible to anti-democratic propaganda. So he says, there are certain people, because of their personality, are prone to being fascist. Now, and then he conducts a scale, he called it the F scale, the fascist scale. He and his team conducted interview with over 2,000 persons to construct a typology of the authoritarian personality. He concluded a childhood experience led to the construction of a certain type of personality that makes one person more than the other vulnerable for fascist propaganda. He constructed an F scale that tells how vulnerable a person is based on 9 traits, 9 characteristics, and a certain type of personality makes it easier for an individual to become fascist. Now, again, what is a critique? Again, empirical validation, because he is only concerned with Nazism and fascism. But what about the enslavement of Africans in Europe? What about their personality? How do you explain uh, this type of fascist behavior, kidnapping people and slave? How do you explain it from personality? Never looked into it, obviously. And when he fled Nazi Germany, he lived in the USA and never applied his theory. Well, when he lived in USA, that was in the era of segregation apartheid in the United States. You see, these philosophers, they have great names in left-wing circles, but at the end of the day, they don't understand racism at all. Okay, and then I'll take another psychological theory and conducted by scholar Milgram, who did an experiment to test the willingness of people to obey authority. Participants were instructed by a teacher to administer electric shocks to a learner who had to give answer to a teacher. If the answer was wrong, the participant would press a button that gave the learner an electric shock, which was fake, but the participant didn't know that. The voltage was increased as the number of wrong answers increased. So there was an actor in the chair who screamed, but it was fake. And he concluded from these experiments, each individual possesses a conscience which to a greater or lesser degree serves to restrain the unimpeded flow of impulses destructive to others. But when he merges his person into an organizational structure, a new creature replaces autonomous man, unhindered by the limitations of the individual morality, freed from human inhibition, mindful only of the sanctions of authority. The personality of an individual is molded by the organizational structure in which it functions, and authority is such a system can lead to a person doing something against his or her own conscious. So my critique of Stanley Milgram is this. Again, empirical validation. How do you explain a historical phenomenon like European enslavement with these personality things? And worse, those who started enslavement of Africans were in a position of authority. It's the authority that started it. It's not somebody who was forced by authority. So these are just, invalid theories with a sheer empirical validation shows it's wrong. Then you had another guy, Daniel Goldhagen, who published a book in 1996, by the way, Hitler's Willing Executioners. He says, look, there's no evidence that Germans were killed or incarcerated for having refused to kill Jews. There's no evidence of peer pressure. So he says the demonological anti-Semitism of the virulent racial variety was the common structure of the perpetrators' cognition and of German society in general. The German perpetrators, in his view, were assenting mass executioners, men and women, who, true to their own eliminationist anti-Semitic belief, faithful to their cultural anti-Semitic critic, considered the slaughter to be just. The personality that developed in Germany was the result of a culture of anti-Semitism that had existed for long. Now, again, Goldhagen is not a general critique theory of racism. It's just trying to understand what happened in Germany, Nazi Germany. why so many people participated in these crimes. But again, it's not general, it doesn't understand racism in general, and the biggest form of racism, the European enslavement of Africa, you know. So, and he doesn't explain why anti-Semitism, which has existed in other countries without fascism, how come that it didn't lead to fascism? So this psychological theory are really theories that doesn't make any sense. Then in progressive circles in the United States, and then it was extended beyond the United States in Europe and in fact worldwide, were also liberal theories, but presented as a critique of society and knowledge production, but basically again based on liberal concept of individualism. Now you have this theory of white privilege. Peggy McIntosh in 1988 published it. She looked at gender and she says, I've often noticed men's unwillingness to grant that they are overprivileged in the curriculum, even though they may grant that women are disadvantaged. Denials that amount to taboos surround the subject of advantages that men gain from women's disadvantages. These denials protect male privilege from being fully recognized, acknowledged, lessened, or ended. And then she extends this concept from gender to race. I think whites are carefully taught not to recognize white privilege as males are taught not to recognize male privilege. So I have begun in an untutored way to ask what it is like to have white privilege. Now, this theory is an insult for black people and people of color, because how can you analyze oppression, exploitation, injustice of people of color? How do you turn that oppression into a privilege of white people? You know, oppression is not a privilege, it's an injustice. And if you use terms like privilege to mask injustice, it's just as a kind of liberal racism, you know, that doesn't acknowledge the injustice that colonialism have imposed. He doesn't understand colonialism. So how does she turns injustice and oppression into a privilege? She changes the origin of racism as a phenomenon that is historical root in colonialism into an occurrence which origin is unclear and invisible. So she talks already about, the privileges are unclear and invisible. This is nonsense. Everybody who studied colonialism knows very well that it was very clear and very visible. She replaced oppression, exploitation, and injustice by unearned assets. She's talking about white privilege, the privilege as unearned assets. How can you do that? How can you take enslavement and say it's an unearned asset? She individualizes racism. The third thing, this enables you to distance yourself from your white community and claim the willingness to give up white privilege. So there are many white people who say, oh, you know, I'm white privileged, and by acknowledging that I'm white privileged, I say I'm not racist. But the whole concept is a racist concept because it doesn't acknowledge colonialism and the origin of the so-called white privilege. And you could see it. She removed the distinction between perpetrator and victim of a crime in slavery. She said, at school we were not taught about slavery in any depth. We were not taught to see slaveholders as damaged people. Slaves were seen as the only group at risk of being dehumanized. What a nonsense is this? Taking slaveholders as damaged people. What does she know about the history? And the fact that she doesn't know tells you not about white privilege, but about about the colonization of the mind. So that's why I argue white privilege is an insult for colonized people to turn oppression, exploitation, and injustice of people of color into a privilege of white people because it lacks any historical dimension. Perpetrators and victims of colonialism, you can't place them on the same level as damaged people. And it blocks the analysis of institutional racism and reduces policies of change to individual behavior. It's no question of institutional change. Then you have another woman, Philomena Esser, in 1984, came up with a theory of everyday racism. So when I heard the term everyday racism, I asked myself, which racism is not everyday but only in the weekend? The concept itself is a ludicrous concept, everyday racism. But she says many studies have identified the mechanism of racism at the societal level, but few have revealed its pervasive impact on the daily experience of Black people. Apparently, she hasn't studied Black struggle because she's unaware of all the studies conducted by major Black thinkers that have dealt extensively with how racism has impacted the daily lives of Black people. Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, and the Nation of Islam, Frantz Fanon, M.A.C. Serre, there's a list there. She doesn't know that Black thinkers have already thought about the so-called everyday, what she calls everyday racism, and what they call institutional racism. And Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and Charles Hamilton has taken the daily experience of people to develop their theory of institutional racism and the definition of racism. So they say about institutional racism, what is racism? The word has represented daily realities to millions of Black people for centuries. Yet this is daily defined, perhaps just because that reality has been such a commonplace. So institutional racism takes as a starting point the daily reality of Black people. And, Assad is completely unaware of all this thinking that has been done. And then she claims that she develops a general theory of racism. The central place of experience in my approach to racism suggests an agenda for another kind of research. It's my aim to demonstrate that the concept of everyday racism has a more general relevance in race relation theory. I present a new approach to the study of racism based on the concept of everyday racism. Individuals are actors in a power structure. Power can be used to reproduce racism, but it can also be used to combat racism. The study shows how power operative in everyday situation perpetuates racial and ethnic oppression. So as I said, my critique of everyday racism is which racism is not everyday but only in the weekend, saying it's talking about everyday racism suggests that there's another type of racism which is not everyday. Now, again, it is historically incorrect. She says the majority of the colonized population has little or no experience with whites on a level of day-to-day interaction. The colonizers, this is nonsense. She doesn't understand that during slavery, every morning, the Black slaves had to assemble before their white masters, and then those who didn't perform well the day before were beaten, and they got their task for the day, and there was a white overseer, apart from Black overseer, that controlled their work. In apartheid, the Black people worked as servants in the household of white people. So just historically, it's incorrect to say that there was little or no experience with whites. And on a daily basis, take apartheid in South Africa. How can you not have daily interaction with people? You see it on the television, you see it in the law, you see it in the street, you see it in the cafe. You are not allowed to enter a white establishment. Just factually incorrect. And then she said the colonizer present themselves as a positive identification model and ignore the relation between colonialism and racism. Again, this is nonsense. The colonizer, had a theory of superiority, which was not a positive identification, that the colonizer should identify it in a positive way. She doesn't know that colonization of the mind, what it is and how it is achieved. So all these psychological theory, have solutions about human interactions as of racism, and that's not institutional. Then a very popular theory, which is in the United States and in especially in academia, but also in social movements across the world, is the concept of intersectionality. And intersectionality has seven propositions. One is the visualization of the concept of intersection. Intersectionality is what occurs when a woman from a minority group tries to navigate the main crossing in the city, says Crenshaw. The main highway is Racism Road. One cross street can be colonialism, then Patriarchy Street. She has to deal not only with one form of oppression, but with all forms, those named as road signs, which link together to make a double, a triple, multiple, and a many-layered blanket of oppression. That's proposition one. Proposition two is acknowledgement of multiple oppressions. He says, because the intersectional experience is greater than the sum of racism and sexism, any analysis that doesn't take intersectionality into account can't sufficiently address the particular manner in which Black women are subordinated. Thus, for feminist theory and anti-racist policy discourse to embrace the experience and concerns of Black women, the entire framework that has been used as a basis for translating women's experience and the Black experience into concrete policy demands must be rethought and recast. Third, the critique of white feminism by Black feminism. The value of feminist theory to Black women is diminished because it evolves from a white racial context that is seldom acknowledged. Not only are women of color in fact overlooked, but their exclusion is reinforced when white women speak for and as women. When feminist theory attempts to describe women's experience through analyzing patriarchy, sexuality, and separate spheres ideology, it often overlooks the role of race. So it's a critique of the racist character of white feminism. A critique of black, and then a fourth is a critique of black males by black feminists. Crenshaw refers to Anna Julia Cooper, a 19th century black feminist. He says Cooper often criticized black leaders and spokespersons for claiming to speak for the race, but failing to speak for black women. Referring to one of Martin Delaney's public claims that where he was allowed to enter the race entered with him, Cooper countered. Only the black women can say when and where I enter, and then the whole Negro race enter with me. The fifth part, the solutions. If any real effort are to be made for free black people of the constraints and conditions that characterizes racial subordination, then theories and strategy purported to reflect the black community's needs must include an analysis of sexism and patriarchy. Similarly, feminism must include an analysis of race if it hopes to express the aspiration of non-white women. And then 6C extends intersectionality beyond the experience of black people to other marginalized groups. She says, it seems that placing those who currently were marginalized in the center is the most effective way to resist efforts to compartmentalize experiences and undermine potential collective action. The goal of this activity should be to facilitate the inclusion of marginalized groups for whom it can be said, when they enter, we all enter. And then the seventh proposition is the critique of identity politics. The problem with identity politics is not that it fails to transcend difference, as some critics charge, but rather the opposite, that it frequently conflates and ignores intra-group differences. In the context of violence against women, the illusion of difference is problematic, fundamentally because the violence that many women experience is often shaped by other dimensions of their identities, such as race and class. Moreover, ignoring differences within groups frequently contribute to tensions among groups, another problem of identity politics that frustrates efforts to politicize violence against women. And so when the practice expound identity as woman or person of color or an either-or proposition, they relegate the identity of women of color to a location that resists telling. So I have 6 points of critique of intersectionality. The first one is racism for me is institutional, not individual. The concept of intersection doesn't fit an analysis of oppression of communities. So, in the theory of intersection, a black community can be positioned on the racism road. But that road can't intersect with patriarchy road because patriarchy is not about the experience of a black community, but of black women. So it's not a community as a whole. So you can't talk about a patriarchal community because you're talking about a section of the community which is patriarchal, which are men. Women are not patriarchal. So um, if you take the concept of the individual, then you can use this visual thing of the road. But if you take the concept of community, the road visualization doesn't fit. Second point, the understanding of the powers that benefit from and sustain oppression. During slavery, white women had the power to sell black men and women as cattle. It would be absurd to argue that black women are on the racism road and intersect the experience of white women on the patriarchy road. Patriarchy in the white world is totally different from patriarchy in the world of enslaved people. So, to use this theory to understand social relations and history, it doesn't work. And then the other thing, intersectionality levels all oppression because oppression is about not about institution but about experience of degradation, dehumanization, etc. So one experience can be valued higher or lower than other experience of oppression. They are all level. In the case of enslavement, the patriarchal oppression of black women is not different from the patriarchal oppression of white women, which is nonsense. The position of white women being oppressed by the system, of women being oppressed by the system, is totally different. It's a white woman with the power to sell a black man or woman on the same road of patriarchy as the black woman. This is clearly ridiculous. Fourth, the incorporation of Western concept into the theory of intersectionality. Intersectionality uses the concept of patriarchy, but that is a Western concept that looks at the relationship between men and women only through the lens of male domination and oppression of women. There are other theories of gender which doesn't come into her narrative at all. So the patriarchy concept of feminism, this perspective reduces human relations to a relation between subjects that are in struggle with each other. And undoubtedly, there is struggle and oppression of women by men. Other theories acknowledge that. But in decolonial theory, we acknowledge another dimension, the relation between men and women, and that is love. It's expressed in stories and songs and all forms of art. So intersectionality uses an invalid theory of gender, which is the concept of feminism and patriarchy. The next point of critique, the lack of acknowledgement of the idea that the liberation in one road of the intersection can be used as an instrument of oppression of individuals on another road and communities on another road. In the West, women's liberation and LGBT plus liberation are used in an imperial narrative of Islamophobia to characterize and demonize Muslim communities in the world. They are being used now in Uganda. The whole LGBT struggle is used to deny people in Uganda funding from the IMF to build hospitals because the government is homophobic, And this tells you now that this theory allows not only liberation but also to justify oppression because in Uganda they are not intersectional. And the sixth point, the erosion of the concept of solidarity. Social movement already had concepts of solidarity, how to connect struggles of oppressed people to one another. It was based in the concept of solidarity. You don't need an invalid concept of intersectionality to express solidarity because the theoretical basis of solidarity is just an ethical construct. What is the base of solidarity with Palestinian people against apartheid in the occupied lands on the basis of a theory of intersectionality? You can't have a justification or a theory about it. But if you take the moral imperative that we need to be in solidarity with all people who are struggling against oppression and for their liberation, that solidarity as concept is very strong. And replacing that strong concept with a weak concept of intersectionality is not progress. Then you have the critical race theory. These also have six propositions. One is they say that racism is ordinary, not aberrational. Aberrational. So they mean normal science, the usual way society does business, the common everyday experience of most colors of people of in this country. They're saying critical race theory is saying that while people who might think that there's no racism because apartheid has been abolished in the United States, and black people with the colonized mind who believe these white people, that system, of apartheid, those people who think there's no racism because apartheid, segregation has been abolished are wrong. That is correct. And then they say it's difficult to eradicate racism because racism advances the interests of both white elite materially and white working class physically. So there's little incentive to eradicate it. Then race and races are products of social thought and relation, not objective, inherent, or fixed. They correspond to no biological or genetical reality. Rather, races are categories that society infants, manipulates, or retires when convenient. This is a response to racist scholars who argue that there are biological differences between human beings that lead to different social positions. But to say that there is no biological racism, or to say that these categories have just been invented, doesn't understand why it was invented, how it was invented. It is not out of convenience. It was a historical imperative of the Enlightenment. If you don't make that connection, you don't understand racism and its historical roots. And then they say the dominant society racializes different minority groups at different times in response to shifting needs such as the labor market. So this addresses the notion that racism is not only about blacks, but also about other groups like Asians who are racialized. Then Proposition 5, the notion of intersectionality and anti-essentialism. No person has a single, easily stated unitary identity. Everyone has potentially conflicting, overlapping identities, loyalties, and allegiances. So intersectionalism is a brand of critical race theory. And then the sixth proposition, the notion of a unique voice of color. Because of their different histories and experience with oppression, Black, Indian, Asians, and Latino writers and thinkers may be able to communicate to their white counterparts matters that the whites are unlikely to know. Minority status, in other words, brings with it a presumed competence to speak about race and racism. So I have 4 points of critique of critical racism. First, the conceptualization is still around individuals. Identity is constructed around the individual and not about community. Racism is about the experience of the individual, although they acknowledge that the experience is also formed through the influence of institutions. Critical race theory doesn't acknowledge the colonization of the mind and presumes that each voice of people of color is a voice that is conscious about what racism is and its oppression. Therefore, it is not able to distinguish between what Malcolm X calls the house Negro and the field Negro. Critical race theory links racism to one specific form. They're critical of biological racism and are therefore not able to position biological racism as theological or cultural racism. Its critique of biological racism is limited to the social construct of race, but doesn't take culture and theology into consideration. There's also a construct of superior culture, not superior race, but superior culture. And I dealt with it extensively, and critical race doesn't even see that is there. The conceptualization of racism along lines of inequality, not along lines of superiority or inferiority. So they talk about inequality and not about superiority, inferiority. It is more about discrimination along lines of class, color, and gender than about superiority, inferiority. And that's why they think in terms of how individuals are treated, not in terms of, for example, how knowledge has been produced as a racist knowledge, as superior, inferior knowledge. So these are the liberal theory of racism, which they are quite predominant in academia and in social movement and in government policies. Then you have the Marxist concept of racism. Marxism doesn't acknowledge race as an organizing factor of society. They are based on class. And the main goal of mankind is liberation from capitalism. And capitalism use different mechanisms to divide class and rule, and the promotion of religious ethnic identity is such a mechanism. It goes against class consciousness. So racism is a mechanism to divide the working class. Black Marxists have dealt more with race and racism, but at the end of the day, they stick to class analysis. And a critique of Marxism, from my point of view, is a general critique. I'll discuss that in future sessions, and where I position Marxism as a theory of the European Enlightenment, part of Eurocentrism, and I'll discuss how, from the global South, thinkers try to develop Marxism in a decolonial way. So I've dealt with all this in chapter 6 of my book. You can download the PowerPoint of this presentation at sandohira.com. And if you want to support the channel, subscribe to it, share it with friends, family, and colleagues, and encourage them to subscribe. Get involved in discussion groups and make a donation if you want. And that can be done through sandohira.com. Thank you.